out there in no man's land, out there in potential, there's threat and like mortal threat, but there's also endless opportunity and riches and wealth and the possibility of attracting someone and all of that. And so, well, the dragon, you can't just be afraid of it, you just stay in your burrow the whole time. And lots of animals more or less do that, you know, especially the nocturnal ones, they just hide away. But that isn't what human beings are like, because we're not only prey animals, right? We're also predators. And then of course we're crazy, we're absolutely insane chimpanzees, right? We're crazy. And so we're always out there mucking about with things and with our, you know, fingers and our thumbs and taking the world apart and putting it back together, and we're crazily exploratory and troublemaking. And so we don't just run from dragons, we go hunt them down. And so there's a story here, the oldest story that mankind knows, and literally it is the oldest story that we know, is this story. And the story basically is there's a bounded space, a walled garden, a walled city, you know, and all the original cities were walled, because if they weren't, barbarians would swoop in and they'd just steal all your stuff. And so, you know, that was kind of pointless. So, you know, you wanted to have some major league walls surrounding your territory, and so that's inhabited space, and inside that is your little dominance hierarchy. And so all you primates knew exactly who was who inside that space, so you didn't have to fight with each other, and you could predict each other's behavior because you believed the same things and saw the world roughly the same way and acted the same way, and so you were sort of secure. But then the problem is that that can always be breached. There's always something outside of it that's a danger, and so that's signified by this little creature here, this dragon. And that twirl in its tail is very common among dragons. It's actually a symbol, because imagistic languages, imagistic symbols have an ancient language, and it's referring to something that's basically eternal. And see, it lives down here in this cave, because it's an underground thing. It's an underground thing, and you can kind of imagine what that's like. And sometimes this happens in initiation rituals among archaic people. When they're going to initiate, usually the young men, because nature initiates women all by itself, usually the young men, maybe they'll put them in a cave and leave them there, you know, for like, well, who knows how long. And so you've got to think, what's in a cave? Now, caves are dark, man. I don't know if you've ever been in one, but like, they're dark, and they're really dark. And so not only is there whatever there is in the cave, and you don't know what the hell's in the cave, there's whatever you imagine might be in the cave. And so when you're in that cave and you're alone, you're confronting the devils and demons and monsters of your own imagination, you know. And so then you have a chance to perhaps deal with that and overcome it, and that's perhaps part of the initiation ceremony, you know, and that's part of growing up, because you have to learn how to face the things that terrify and upset you and recast them and put them back together. We talked a little bit about this idea of the pre-cosmogonic chaos that Iliad refers to, and that's the stuff out of which order is produced at the beginning of time, and it's also the stuff out of which you constantly reproduce order. And the Jungians, the psychoanalysts, especially the really deep psychoanalysts like Jung, Freud was a more surface psychoanalyst, and that's not an insult. There's some things that Freud figured out that are absolutely amazing. He was a precursor to Jung for sure. For Jung, the hero's journey was the journey inside the unconscious, and that would be perhaps in some sense that the willingness to face everything terrible that's happened to you, and to think it through and to articulate it, and to come to grips perhaps with your own capacity for malevolence. That was a really important part of Jungian ideas, that the first step towards individuation, which is the manifestation of your full self, let's say, was the discovery of your shadow. And your shadow is the part of you that will do terrible things under the right circumstances, and maybe even without that much provocation. And you know, and it's a terrifying part of you to come into contact with, because it's sort of the way that you're specifically attached to the archetype of evil. That's a good way of thinking about it. And you know, modern people, they don't really think much about the idea of good and evil, but that's because most of them are so damn naive, you can just barely even comprehend it. You know, if you read any history, if you really read it, like, and you don't come away with the idea that evil exists, it's like you're just reading the wrong kind of history, you know. It's just unbelievable what people can do to each other. And we're so imaginative, you know. And one of the things I figured out about people, the reason that we're we have the knowledge of good and evil, let's say, is that because we're self-conscious and we know about ourselves, we know about our own vulnerability, right? You know what hurts you. You really know what hurts you, way more than an animal knows. And so, and you're also creative, and so once you know what hurts you, man, you can really hurt someone else. And you can do it in such a creative way. You can draw it out, you can make it excruciating, you can take people apart physically and psychologically, and you can keep them, say, even right on the edge of death, so that you can keep doing that endlessly. And you know, that happens, hell of a lot more than you think it happens. It happens a lot. And so, well, and you think, well, you know, that doesn't involve me. It's like, oh yes it does, man, that's the problem, because you know, you're human, and that's the sort of things that human beings are capable of. And I'm not saying it's all probable that you do that ever, or that, but I'm saying that, you know, you got to take that into account. When you're looking at the world and you think about all the perpetrators out there, it's not like there's perpetrators and there's victims. That isn't how it works. It doesn't work that way at all. And so the horrors of humanity, as well as the noble elements of humanity, are all elements of your central being. And for Jung, and this is the terrible thing, for Jung, the pathway to higher wisdom was through the terrible portal of, well, you could say hell, for that matter. Really. And so who wants to do that, man? It's like, no. You know, like maybe you're resentful about something. Well, you probably are, because like everybody's resentful about something, you know. And resentment is just a vicious emotion. It's really useful. It's really useful, because if you're resentful about something, it either means that you should grow the hell up and accept the responsibility and quit sniveling around and whining, or it means that someone actually is oppressing you and pushing on you too hard and bullying you and demeaning you, and you have something to say or do that you're not saying or doing. And no wonder you're not saying or doing it, because, you know, it can be really dangerous to say things or do them to free yourself from being oppressed. You can get in a lot of trouble in the short term for doing it, so it's easier just to not say anything, sort of day after day. In the short term you protect yourself, but it just crushes you. And then the resentment comes up, and resentment, man, that can just get so out of hand, you know. It starts with resentment, and then it goes to the desire for revenge, you know, because you'll play nasty little tricks on the person that's oppressing you. At any chance you'll talk about them behind their back, and if they want you to do something, you'll do it badly, or you'll do it grudgingly, or you'll do a half-rate job, and you'll set up little traps, and you know, so it puts you in a poisonous space. And then if you really start to dwell on that, say, in your basement for 3 or 4 years about just exactly how terrible the world is, and how that's focused on you, and how everyone's rejected you, and how you get to this point where you're thinking that, you know, existence itself is a kind of poisonous endeavor, and that the best thing for you to do is go out there and do as much, you know, create as much mayhem as you possibly can. And if you really get to a dark place, you think, I'm going to create as much mayhem as I possibly can by targeting the most innocent thing I can possibly imagine. And so that's a bad road, man. There's dark things down there, but you can go there, and people do, and they go through the hole of resentment. And so resentment can tell you you've got something to say. You bloody well better say it. You gotta free yourself from what's oppressing you. You have to stand up for that, because otherwise you become oppressed, and then once you're oppressed, that's just not so good. And so, like in your marriage and your relationships, you got to tell people what you're thinking. You don't have to assume you're right. That's a whole different story, because you're not, because you're, you know, ignorant and you're biased, and you know, so you're not right, but you can stumble towards the expression of yourself, and then you can listen to the other person and hope that they tell you some way that you're stupid that's useful, so you can be a little less stupid in the future, because wouldn't that be good? And so, you know, you go after the unknown. You don't protect what you know. You already know what you know. You go after what you don't know. That's why you have to talk to people you don't agree with. That's why you have to talk to your enemies, because they're going to tell you things you don't know. You could even listen to them. It's possible they know a thing or two you don't know. But people don't like that, you know. They just talk to people who think the same way, and then they just stay stupid. And so that's not good, because if you're not wise, the world will wallop you. It'll flatten you, and far more than it has to. And then you'll be bitter and resentful, and you'll be part of that force that wallops instead of the force that fights against that. So, well, so you go after the dragon, and that's what this guy is doing. He's going after the dragon. It's threatening the society, because it always does. Chaos, what's outside of order, always threatens order. Always. Always. And so you have to step forward, you know, in this manner, voluntarily, and go after that when it's still manageable, right? And that's the case in your own life too. So, you know, if you've had a proclivity to be bullied in the past, you know, and you want to get out of that, what you have to do is you have to make yourself awake to the what would you say, to the initial stages of that sort of bullying emerging in your life again, that sort of domination, and you have to step forward against it when it's still in its developing stages, because maybe you can just not have it happen. That would be better. And so you have to be ready to speak what you have to say more or less on a moment's notice. You can't be impulsive about it. You know, like if you and I are talking and you make a mistake or I make a mistake, even if it bothers one or the other of us, we should just write it off, because it's like one encounter. What the hell? You know, maybe you had a bad night's sleep or something, you know. So you got to be a little forgiving. But if it happens twice, then, you know, you should be a little awake. And you should remember both times. And then if it happens a third time, it's like that's when you act. And you say, look, we talked and this happened, and I thought, yeah, whatever. But then you did it again. And then you just did it again. Well, then the person is basically like, what are they going to do? You know, no, well, maybe they might argue with you, but you kind of got them. And generally, if you just point that out to people, just like that, just that you noticed and are willing to say something about it, they'll back the hell off. They'll often apologize. And sometimes you even make them a little more conscious, which is like, hey, that's not such a bad idea. And that's what all this means. And so this chaos idea, so for Jung it was the unconscious, right? It was the contents of your unconscious. And so that might be the unknown past, the threatening past that you have never dealt with. Might be the threatening future. It might be the threatening present. But Jung realized as he got older that the unconscious was also the world. And you think, and so the chaos is not only your unconscious mind, which meets the unknown, but it's actually the unknown itself mingled together. And you think, what the hell does that part? That's why the dragon is a land creature and an air creature. It's matter and spirit at the same time. And this sort of gets us into constructivism. Because the constructivists think that basically what happens is that you encounter those elements of the world that don't fit into your theory, and out of those new elements you make the world through your perceptions, and you make yourself by incorporating the information and transforming yourself. And that's how Piaget explains the development of a child. The child starts out with some reflexes, basic reflexes, and manifesting the reflexes produces results in the world, and then the child has to reorganize its perceptions to take into account the transformations, and so then it gets a little more sophisticated, and then it can do a few more things, and then it can manifest more changes in the world, and then it tracks them and modifies its perceptions and actions to account for them, and it just keeps doing that, and that's how the child boots itself up, like a computer does. Okay, so fine, so it specifies your perceptions, your target, the current reality, and the likely procedure that you're going to use to make all of that interrelated. But it does more than that. So we're going to look at it from a couple of different perspectives. So the classic and archaic way of thinking about perception is the world's full of objects, you see the objects, you think about them, you evaluate them, then you act on them. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. First of all, the world is not made out of objects. The world is made out of, I think the world is made out of tools and obstacles. And it's because you can't not perceive the world in relationship to you. And what you perceive actually are the meaning of objects. You perceive the patterns. A tool is something like a meaningful pattern or a useful pattern. It's something like that. And so look, again, you look at, I might say to someone, describe this room. Now you're going to pick a level of description that's very particular. You're going to pick one that other human beings could understand. So it's going to be predicated on your size, for example. And it's going to be predicated on your knowledge that that other person is a lot like you and has a lot of the same underlying structures and motivations. So, and that's an implicit predicate of your description. So we're going to say, well, it's kind of an ordinary classroom. It's got 20 rows of tables that each have 5 chairs at it, and each of them has 5 chairs. There's some posts that hold them up. There's a couple of speakers. There's a podium. There's a screen. There's some additional chairs. There's a scattering of people. There's some electronic equipment. And so, you know, of course, that there's an infinite number of things I could be describing in this room, right? Like I could be describing, there's a lot of color variation in that tile. So if I look at it, I can see that it's unlike the other tiles because the light is reflecting off it. So it's got a shiny white element. There's about, God only knows, 1 million different scratches in it, each of which are unique. I can't even really tell what color it is. It kind of looks like an off grayish green. But if I was painting it, to get a reasonable representation, I'd have to have at least 6 or 7 shades of green, ranging from quite dark to almost white. And that's only if I look at it from here. If I look at it from here, well then you get the point, right? I mean, there is an infinite number of details in this room. There's an infinite number of facts in this room. That's also why I don't believe that you can derive an ought from an is. It's like, you know, that's the old Humean issue, right? You cannot derive ethical guidelines from factual knowledge. And I think the reason for that is, which facts are you going to pick? How are you going to select them? There's an infinite number of them, even in a constrained situation. So, merely by attending to some and not attending to others, you're already using an ethic. Because you can't attend to one thing and not another without being ensconced in one of these value structures. Because the value structure is what determines the direction of your attention. And so you can't make the argument that you're using the infinite number of facts that are available at your disposal to govern how you're looking at the facts. You're not. That isn't what you're doing. It's not possible to do that. So what do? Well, you describe the things in the room that would be relevant to other people. Otherwise you're going to bore them to death, or they're going to think you're insane. You know, so, or an artist maybe, because an artist might do the kind of concentration on a detail that I just described, but he's obviously, or she's obviously trying to paint the thing or represent it somehow. So it's still tool-like. Well, why do you want to know that there are tables? Well, because you sit at them. Why do you want to know if there are chairs? Because you sit in them. You know, what about the screen or the camera equipment? Well, they're all usable tools. And so that's what you describe. You describe the world at the level of usable tool. Or you might also say, you know, look out for that girl who's in the third row. She's trouble. And so you might call out someone if you're describing the room, because there's somewhere in that room that if you go, you're going to get into trouble. And so those are sort of the things that seem to me to be relevant. There are tools that move you along your way, facilitators, that's another way of thinking about them, and there are obstacles that get in your way. And there's a tiny set of those, otherwise you get overwhelmed. You're not going to go anywhere where it's all obstacles, right? You don't even want, you don't want to be in that place. You want to be in a place where it's mostly this. And then there's the biggest category though, this is what's cool, this is so important, is the biggest perceptual category is that which is not relevant at this time. Because it contains everything. You know, like when you're writing on this pad, you assume the entire world around you is constant, and therefore you can ignore it. It's everything out there. All the transformations that are taking place, you turn to zero. And you just focus on maybe the space that's occupied by a single letter. Your whole world shrinks down to just that single letter, and everything else is ignored. Well, what happens if something goes wrong? This is the thing, this is why this is so important. What happens if something goes wrong? An indeterminate set of those irrelevant entities has now become relevant. That's the problem, is the invisibility disappears. And so, for example, you're all treating each other in this room right now as ignorable entities, roughly speaking. You could all be blobs from a perceptual perspective. And if you look at how you see the room, except for the person that you're focusing on, everyone else is a blob. And some of them are virtually invisible blobs. And that's fine, because you're adequately represented as a blob unless you do something that disturbs the ongoing flow of goal-directed action. Just like the gorilla thing, right? So the damn gorilla was invisible because it didn't get in the way, even though you'd think of course you'd see a gorilla. It's like everything that doesn't get in the way is invisible, except for that small fraction of things that you can use for your purpose. And that's how you perceive. So it's so mind-boggling, that, because it puts perception into the realm of ethics. It isn't what you'd expect. You see what you're aiming at. And you know that. You know that. You're standing on a street corner and you look up. And soon there's 10 advanced chimpanzees like you right beside you looking up to see what the hell it is that you're aiming at. Because they assume just by watching you that if you're focusing your perception on something and you're fixated on it, that it's relevant and important. It's tool-like or maybe obstacle-like. It's relevant for some reason. And so we live in a landscape of relevance. And that's to me, that's an absolutely mind-boggling idea, because that is way different than living in a landscape of facts. It is not the same thing, even a little bit. And there are philosophers who pursued that idea quite, well, I would say to quite an incredible degree. Heidegger is probably the one who's done that more than anyone else. But the 19th century pragmatists were very interested in that as well. But because the classic scientific idea is something like you perceive a universe of facts and derive conclusions and act. It's like, no, you don't. You perceive a landscape of pre-categorized relevance that's dependent on your ethic. Jesus, it's so peculiar, that. And so that brings up real questions like, what ethic best structures your perceptions? Well, that is the interesting idea as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so then we can make this a little bit more interesting, I think is the right way of thinking about it. Okay, well, so you've got tools and obstacles, but they're not dead. That's the other thing. Because we're in an ethical landscape, because we're in a motivated landscape, whether something is a tool or an obstacle actually matters to you. And we can actually define matter. Matter is a weird word, because there's matter, and then there's the things that matter. And you could say the world is made out of matter, or you could say that the world is made out of things that matter. And I would say you act like the world is made out of things that matter. You might say, I don't believe that, I believe it's made out of matter. But no, you don't, because that's not how you act. It might be what you say you do, but it is not what you do. So why do things matter? Well, first of all, irrelevant things don't matter. And thank God for that, right? Because if everything mattered, it's, well, you're either in the midst of an LSD trip, or you're schizophrenic, or you're in real serious trouble. So you want most things to be irrelevant. Now that's kind of dull, and it takes the glory and the glamour out of the world, but from a cognitive perspective, it's definitely an advantage. So irrelevancy, man, that's critical. And a huge amount of what you have done is learned irrelevance. It's the basis of your cognitive knowledge, is learned irrelevance. What to ignore. Okay, fine, so that zeroes things out. You turn most of the world into zero. Well, then you have this small subset of things that are beneficial to you, that you can use for the purposes of your current operation, which we'll define in more detail. You can use that for the purposes of your current endeavor. And then you have obstacles. And so, for example, if I'm late for class, so I'm in a particular state of mind, and I walk in here and I see that, I'm going to get a little burst of negative emotion. It's irritation. And the reason for that is not a recycling bin then. It's an obstacle that some dimwit left there just to annoy me. And I mean, you know what I mean. That's how you react to the world in a situation like that. It's like, it's not a recycling bin. If it's here, and I don't want to stand there, then it's a recycling bin. If it's there, it's an obstacle. And as soon as I look at it, it isn't that I see it and then get annoyed. It's that annoyance is part of the perception. Because it's an obstacle in my pathway, the emotion comes along with the perception. It's not laden on top of it. It's not, oh, I don't think that's a recycling bin. That's in the wrong place. Now it's in my way. I should be annoyed. That isn't what happens, is the annoyance. My suspicions are that the damn annoyance is faster than the object perception, because it's a more primordial circuit. So You actually, now there's a great book if you're interested in this sort of thing. There's a great book called An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, which was written by a guy named Gibson back in the 70s, and it's brilliant. His fundamental conclusion is, I think, wrong, but it doesn't matter. The book is not only brilliant because, see, he was the guy that came up with the idea of affordance. And an affordance is something that affords some utility, and that can be positive or negative. And he thought about the world as being full of furniture, roughly speaking, something like that. And that what you saw, what you perceived directly was the affordance. And so imagine the visual cliff experiment. So let's say I put a piece of glass over top of the space between these two tables, no chair there. And I take a duck, and I put the duck here, and the duck walks out on the glass. The duck doesn't care. It'll just walk out on the glass. Well, it's an aquatic animal, and so if there's depth underneath it, it doesn't really bother a duck. But if you put a human infant on there, old enough to crawl, the human infant will look over, and it's not going on that glass. And you might say, well, what does it see? And you could say it sees a space between the two tables and infers that it might fall, but it's like 8 months old. Like, what the hell? It's inferring that? No, it's not. It sees a place to fall off of. And that's Gibson's fundamental point, is that you don't see a cliff. You see a falling off place. And of course, why wouldn't you see that? Because if that isn't what you saw, you wouldn't be here, because one of your dopey ancestors would have wandered off the cliff and died. The ones that saw a falling off place, they just stayed away from that. And you know, if you have vertigo, and even if you don't, if you're up on the 35th floor of an apartment building and you walk out onto the balcony, it's really interesting to notice your perception, because you might think, well, you see the space and you become afraid. It's like, no, you don't. You walk closer to it and your body, you perceive the damn thing with your body. You can also see it, but you perceive it with your body. It's like, don't go there. Don't go any closer. And there's an automatic mapping of that place onto do this. Go away from there. And that's underneath and faster than the actual, quote, conscious object perception.